When we think of Abraham Lincoln, we often imagine the stoic face on Mount Rushmore, the man with the tall stovepipe hat, the Great Emancipator, the president who saved the Union and ended slavery. But the real Abraham Lincoln was far more complex, more human, and more haunted than the myth suggests. Born on February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin in the wilderness of Kentucky, Lincoln's early life was marked by relentless hardship. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, died when he was just 9 years old, leaving him with a deep sense of loss that would follow him for the rest of his life. His relationship with his father was distant and often strained. From an early age, young Abraham turned to books, finding solace in words and ideas in a world that otherwise offered him little comfort. As he grew, Lincoln's towering height and awkward frame made him stand out physically, but it was his sharp wit, storytelling ability, and deep introspection that truly set him apart. He taught himself grammar, law, and philosophy. There was no formal education, only candlelight and determination. But behind his humor and folksy charm, Lincoln carried a heavy emotional burden. Throughout his life, he struggled with what we would now recognize as clinical depression. Friends and colleagues often described him as melancholic, prone to long periods of silence, with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of sorrow. Politically, Lincoln wasn't an overnight success. His early career was filled with defeats. Failed business ventures, lost elections, and crushing setbacks seemed to define him. But each failure taught him resilience. Slowly, he climbed the political ladder, first as a member of the Illinois state legislature, then as a lawyer riding the circuit courts, and eventually as a congressman. But it wasn't until the 1850s, when the country stood bitterly divided over slavery, that Lincoln's voice truly rose above the noise. His debates with Stephen Douglas became national spectacles. Lincoln spoke not just with logic, but with moral clarity. He painted slavery not as a political issue but as a profound human tragedy. And then came the election of 1860. Against all odds, Abraham Lincoln, a man with little formal education, no great wealth, and almost no national political experience, was elected the 16th President of the United States. But with his victory came disaster. Within months, southern states began to secede. The country was splitting apart. By April 1861, the first shots of the Civil War echoed across the nation. Lincoln now found himself in an unimaginable position, leading a fractured country into the bloodiest conflict in American history. His decisions during this time would define his legacy, but each came at a terrible cost. For 4 long years, Lincoln wrestled with military strategy, political infighting, and overwhelming casualty reports. Letters from widows and mothers piled up on his desk. Thousands of young men, many no older than Lincoln's own sons, were dying by the day. As the war dragged on, Lincoln made one of the most controversial and courageous decisions of his presidency, issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. It wasn't just a political maneuver, it was a moral statement that redefined the purpose of the war. From that moment forward, the Civil War wasn't just about preserving the Union, it was about ending slavery. But Lincoln knew the risks. The decision alienated many in the North and intensified hatred from the South. Assassination threats became a daily reality. Yet through it all, Lincoln pressed on. Even in his darkest hours, he found time for humor, telling stories, sharing jokes with cabinet members, and visiting wounded soldiers. But those close to him noticed. The weight on his shoulders grew heavier with each passing month. The lines on his face deepened. His once dark hair turned almost entirely gray. Then, in April 1865, after years of unimaginable bloodshed, the Union finally prevailed. The Civil War was coming to an end. Lincoln delivered his second inaugural address, a speech filled not with triumph, but with compassion, urging the nation to heal, with malice toward none, with charity for all. Just days later, on April 14, 1865, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., while enjoying the performance of our American cousin. John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer, slipped into the President's box and fired a single bullet into the back of Lincoln's head. The next morning, at 7:22 a.m., Abraham Lincoln was pronounced dead. The news sent shockwaves across the country. People wept openly in the streets. Even many in the former Confederacy mourned his loss. But even in death, Lincoln's story didn't end. His funeral procession became one of the largest in American history. His legacy grew, evolving from that of a political leader to a symbol of unity, perseverance, and moral courage. Over the decades, Lincoln became a legend memorialized in marble, textbooks, and currency. But behind the statues and speeches was always the same man, a deeply flawed, emotionally burdened, but fiercely determined human being. who rose from poverty and obscurity to guide a broken nation through its darkest days. Abraham Lincoln wasn't perfect. He doubted himself. He made political compromises. He suffered more personal pain than most of us can imagine. But perhaps it was exactly those imperfections that made him great. So, who really was Abraham Lincoln? He was not just a president, not just a martyr. He was a man, struggling against impossible odds, who chose, time and again, to do what he believed was right, no matter the cost. And that's what makes his story timeless. If you want to uncover the real stories behind more iconic and controversial historical figures, hit that subscribe button now, because history is full of legends, but their real stories are often hidden.